Thanks for joining me today for this synopsis video covering my brief analysis of the Falkland Islands War. In the last segment, we covered the Argentine invasion of Port Stanley and the British response. Today, we'll cover the British amphibious landings and touch on the land campaign conducted by the British Joint Task Force in May of 1982. By late April, the task force had arrived, and on April 25th, a joint SAS and Royal Marine Strike Force retook South Georgia Island with no difficulty and little resistance. The rest of the Falkland Islands group were not so easily taken. The land campaign overall was difficult for British forces due to the fact that British paratroopers from the 2nd Para and the Royal Marines had to ruck or yamp across rugged terrain in order to reach their objectives. With Port Stanley as their objective, British commanders decided to distance their infill to protect British civilians and reduce casualties. It was good logic to draw Argentine forces out and away from Stanley, but all of this would degrade the fitness and readiness of British troops when it came time to fight. British forces landed in a small natural bay named San Carlos Water, located on the west side of East Falkland. They were met with no resistance by land. The Royal Navy executed a successful discharge of all ground task force elements from the troop transport, the SS Canberra, to the landing platform docks, the HMS Intrepid and the HMS Fearless. The LPDs are amphibious warfare ships specifically designed for a literal discharge using LCUs, LCVPs, and LCMs. They simultaneously discharge thousands of Marines and paratroopers, along with thousands of kilograms of equipment, commodity stocks, and rolling stock in support of the land campaign. The amphibious landing was momentous as it marked Britain's largest amphibious operation since their conflict in the Suez Canal of the 1950s. The Royal Navy did an exceptional job under extreme pressure in delivering the personnel and equipment, especially since as many as 9 RAF-operated airlift assets were lost in a strike to the Atlantic conveyor. I'll get into this in a future episode, or a future segment rather. The Royal Navy's involvement in the land campaign was not limited to this amphibious operation. The Royal Navy continued to support the warfighters with naval gunfire support, waterborne logistics assistance, vertical movement participation, and higher echelon medical care. The discharge of personnel and equipment was conducted from May 21, 1982 through May 25, 1982, during which time Argentine A-4 pilots strafed British vessels supporting the discharge and amphibious landings. The Argentine pilots flew below radar and often dangerously skimmed just above the sea level to be perfectly positioned to launch the exocets. They were successful a lot. One of the most important victories was the sinking of the SS Atlantic conveyor. This ship was a logistics vessel that carried critical supplies and 6 Chinook troop carrier helicopters to be used by British forces in the land campaign. So this was a big deal because without these helicopters, British land forces would now have to traverse all of this difficult terrain by foot. The loss of other critical supplies further strained all elements of the task force, as any resupply effort would take 2 to 3 weeks to arrive. Argentine pilots knew where to strike and how to fully leverage the high-performing Exocet missile. The Exocet missile was a technology that helped to equal the playing field for the underperforming Argentine forces. I shouldn't say underperforming, but rather less proficient and skilled than their British counterparts. The Argentine pilots were limited, though, in that they had no existing airbase since Stanley's airstrip would not accommodate the fighters. They had to launch from Argentina and fly more than 300 miles to arrive at the exclusion zone. They were literally turning and burning. Loitering was not an option. By the end of the conflict, the Argentine Air Force had sunk 6 British ships and 1 landing craft utility, or LCU. Despite the Argentine strafing victories, the British did discharge all men and equipment, and they did establish a beachhead which facilitated a relatively safe discharge for the remaining land force to debark. The Harrier caps being flown by the RAF and the fleet, along with the Rapier systems, provided adequate protection to the troops that were being shuttled aboard the LCUs and LCVPs. Rapiers were in defense, and those are surface-to-air missile systems that were among the first cargo shipments to be brought ashore and were positioned and activated on day one of the amphibious landings. Unfortunately, they were having issues with the guidance system, but still served as a deterrent for Argentine pilots operating in the area. Conversely, the Argentine land campaign was a disaster. Once landed and supplied, the British infantry and Royal Marines marched south to retake the settlements of Darwin and Goose Green, where they did meet significant resistance. The second para stepped off first on May 27th for a short yomp towards Goose Green, where they would engage the Argentine 12th Infantry Regiment. That's where a savage firefight took place. The 400 members of the 2nd Parachute Battalion took on 1,200 Argentine conscripts, and though outnumbered 3-1, they emerged victorious as their training and experience became very evident, and despite the significant numerical disadvantage, their brilliant maneuvering won them all engagements with the 12th Infantry Regiment. Meanwhile, up at the north of San Carlos Bay, the 3rd Para and the 45th Commando stepped off on their yomp towards Mount Kent, which would be the ORP, or Objective Rally Point, for the objective, which was Port Stanley. If we drew phase lines, Mount Kent would be the final protective line, or FPL. It was becoming apparent that even at the platoon and squad level, the British forces were far superior in movement and maneuver. Once the 2nd Para had seized the high ground overlooking Stanley and all of the other settlements west of Stanley, it became quite apparent that victory was imminent. With British forces now surrounding and blockading Stanley, the Argentine commander of ground forces, General Mario Menendez, was left with no alternative but to surrender, and he did on June 14, 1982. While there were certainly some significant air and sea battles, the land campaign was the main effort, with the re-seizure of the capital town of Stanley. That was the fundamental decisive action of the land campaign and of the war. General Menendez's surrender on June 14th effectively ended the war. British forces captured 11,400 Argentine prisoners throughout the war, most in Stanley, all of which were hungry, out of ammunition, and completely demoralized. The conscripting methodology was a disaster for the Argentine junta. Anyways, just a reminder, the intent of this book and video review is to provide a brief analysis of this short war. I do get more granular later with a particular focus on some of the more strategic aspects of this conflict. I certainly welcome discussions concerning the tactics employed, and I plan to drill down on the land campaign in later segments. There was certainly a lot more going on, and I haven't even touched on the Welsh Guards deployment, which was certainly very impactful to the campaign. So leave me a thumbs up if you liked this video. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.